Hey guys, welcome back to second video of Unit 1. And we're going to continue our talk about the digestive system. And we're going to look at the anatomy and the physiology of the digestive system. Now, when I hear the words anatomy and physiology, I think of form and function. So when you're going through these videos and you're going through your notes, keep in mind, when we talk about anatomy, we're talking about what and where. So what structure are we talking about? Where does it occur? And we're worried about identification and naming and stuff like that. And then we talk about physiology. Now we're talking about the function, how it works, what makes it tick, and so on and so forth. So this whole course will be talking about anatomy, the form, and physiology, which is the function. So keep that in mind as you're going to go through this. So we're going to start off with the oral cavity, which is generally the start of the digestive system anyways. So you'll hear the oral cavity called the mouth, is obviously the most common term, and you'll also hear it called the buccal cavity. Okay, so all those three terms all mean the same thing. The functions, when we're talking about the oral cavity, we've got four listed here on the slides. First is taste, which may not seem terribly important when you're eating something really tasty, really delicious, but taste is actually an analysis of what you're eating. So oftentimes if something tastes bad, you spit it out, and that's a defense that can protect you against eating something that could possibly cause you to be sick or cause you harm. So taste is quite important, and of course it happens in the mouth. The second is mechanical processing or chewing. We use our teeth to break down our food. We first of all make it into smaller pieces so that we can swallow it, and second of all, by breaking it down into smaller pieces, we're increasing the surface area that we can have our enzymes to work on it. We produce saliva in our mouth, and this helps us not only lubricate our food so it's easier to swallow, but it also provides a place where enzymes can work, and it also helps us taste our food as well. And then finally, besides the mechanical digestion that we just talked about in chewing, there also is a small amount of chemical digestion. We have enzymes in our mouth that can break down carbohydrates and lipids, but in terms of the bigger picture, although there is chemical digestion happening in the mouth, there's absolutely no absorption that happens here. Okay, so those are the main functions of the oral cavity. So in the next couple of slides, we'll look at stuff in a little bit finer detail. So this slide here is giving you a look at the oral cavity, or the mouth, and you can see the different parts, and they're outlined here. I won't go into it too much detail because we're going to go through it in the next few slides. Okay, so we've got a cutaway here on the side showing sagittal section, I believe, of the mouth. You can see the body of the tongue. You can see, well, the cheeks are removed here. But we want to point out two things. First of all, we've got the hard palate, which the blue arrow is showing here, and then we get the soft palate, which is the where the green arrow is indicating. And if you push your tongue along the top of your mouth, you'll actually feel a point, this point right here, where we switch from hard palate to soft palate. This is important because the hard palate is actually skin or mucous membrane that's extended over bone. And then we get our soft palate back here, which is basically just membranes and tissue. The hard palate is quite important because it allows for quite efficient breaking down of food. You may not realize it when you're chewing, but your tongue has a lot of action moving food around inside your mouth, and a lot of times what your tongue does is it squashes food up against that hard palate and helps break it down. The soft palate here, this is going to be a structure that supports some tissue, and we've got a structure here called the uvula, and what will happen is the uvula will move up and block off the nasal cavity, and that way when you swallow, you don't have any food moving up into your nasal cavity, which could be unhealthy, could cause some damage. So the cheeks form the outside part of the mouth, the lateral sides, then we get on the top, we get the hard and the soft palate, and then the bottom base of the mouth is occupied by the tongue. Now the tongue is super important. Not only does it allow us to manipulate our food while we're chewing and eating, but it also allows us to make sounds, to talk, to form language, and so on and so forth. So the tongue is quite quite an important muscle. And you can see here the shape of the tongue. When we look at it in cross section, it's quite a bit different than you normally think of your tongue. But one of the things that you'll notice is it's very, very muscular. So the tongue's got an incredible amount of muscle, and it can move stuff around in your mouth quite efficiently. One other function of the tongue is it secretes an enzyme called lingual lipase. Now, when we're talking about enzymes, don't forget this suffix. If we see ASE, there's a good chance we're referring to an enzyme. Lingual is the descriptor for tongue, so lingual lipase is going to be an enzyme secreted by the tongue that breaks down lipids. So when you have you eat something that's fatty, the first chemical that it's going to help break down the fat that you're eating is going to be this lingual lipase, and that'll happen in the mouth. So one of the most important, well, one of the functions we talked about earlier was the mechanical digestion. Okay, the scientific word, or the fancy word for mechanical digestion or chewing, is mastication. Okay. And mastication is going to help us do a lot of things. It's going to help us break through connective tissue when we eat meat, for example. It's going to help us break down plant fibers, which can be very, very tough when we eat fruits and vegetables. And chewing will help mix all of that food together. It'll help mix it with saliva, and in that saliva we're going to have those enzymes that we talked about. Well, we talked about lingual lipase. We're going to talk about another one in a little while, but this helps us prepare our food for the rest of the process that's going to be digestion. All right, let's go through the very basic function, or sorry, form of the mouth, and we'll look at the bones of the mouth first. So we have two bones that make up our mouth, two major bones. We have the maxilla, which is a bone that's firmly attached to the skull. It doesn't move, and it makes up your top row of teeth. And then we have the bone underneath that. It's called the mandible, and the mandible is your jawbone, and that holds your bottom set of teeth, your bottom dental arch, as it's so called. So here's a look at the two bones that make up the mouth, and then we're going to move into the teeth. I'm not going to expect you guys to know every detail about teeth, but you should know some of the anatomy. In this slide here, we're going to show you three different sections that are important. You have the crown, which is the visible portion of your tooth. So if you go to the mirror now and you put a big smile on, all you're going to see are crowns. At the point where the crown meets your gum, we call that the neck of the tooth. And then below that, the part of the tooth that's embedded in the bone of the jaw, both the maxilla and the mandible, is going to be the root. Okay, so three major sections of the tooth. We get the crown, we get the neck, this area right here, and then below that everything is going to be the root. Now the root in each tooth is quite important, is because it's what holds it in place, it's what gives it its strength, and it's what keeps the tooth healthy. The tooth does have a blood supply, it does have a nerve supply, it does have nerve tissue in there, so there are some feeling in the tooth. Part of the tooth is living tissue, so it's quite important. And this innervation and this connection between the living part of the tooth and the outside part of the enamel is controlled by the roots. The alveolus is what some people will call the tooth socket. Okay, it's the part of the bone that surrounds and holds the tooth in place. Now the actual tooth is connected to the bone by a substance, or by ligaments, basically. So the same idea as you'd have in your elbows and your knees. We have these tiny ligaments that go back and forth between the bone and the root of the tooth. Now the outside of the root of the tooth is not covered in enamel like we'd see on the crown, but it's covered in a compound called cementum. So there's a layer of ligaments called the periodontal ligament, and that goes between the cementum of the tooth and the alveolus, the bone, and that's what holds your tooth in place. Now, teeth are made up of of the hardest biological known material, and that's called enamel. So the outside part of your tooth, the pearly whites that you can see when you look in the mirror, is going to be a compound or a structure called enamel. And it's the hardest biological substance on the planet. Okay? It's way harder than bone. It's way harder than the next compound in teeth, which is called dentin. And we're very happy that it is quite hard because it allows us to chew up and it helps us to break down some really tough food particles. Excuse me. So the teeth are mainly made up of dentin. So if we look at that picture there, all of this area here, the brown area, is going to be a compound called dentin. And dentin has tubules associated with it, and that allows nutrients to get into the dentin tissue. It also allows you to have some sensation in the dentin. And the dentin is a living part of the tooth. The enamel on the outside, so the white part out here, this is not going to be considered living tissue. So if you have a small cavity and you go to the dentist could take a drill, so the cavity is right here, say. As long as it doesn't touch the dentin, then we could just take a drill, and it might be uncomfortable, but you wouldn't actually have any pain if he filled that part of your tooth. If it had to touch the dentin, that's a different story, okay? We get tooth decay by cavities and stuff like that, like I just mentioned, because we get bacteria that live down in these little crevices, and they undergo metabolism called fermentation. It creates an acid, and the acid can wear down over time and break down the enamel, causing a little hole. If that hole gets really big and it reaches down to the dentin, then you can get a pretty bad toothache. Ideally, you'd notice the cavity, your dentist would notice the cavity on your checkup, and we'd get it filled before it made it into the dentin. Okay, so we have our enamel, like we just talked about. We've got our dentin that we just talked about, and inside that we get this area here called the pulp cavity. Inside the pulp cavity, we're going to have all of the really living tissue that makes up a tooth. So inside the pulp cavity, you're going to see blood vessels, you're going to see nerves, and you're going to see the canal. So it's it's full of blood vessels and nerves, but it's a space that allows all of those things to pass out through the tooth and into the bone and the tissue below the tooth. So that's called the root canal. And then the hole at the bottom of the tooth down here where those blood vessels and roots escape, though, it's called the apical foramen. Oftentimes, if you see the word foramen, it means a hole in a bone. So an apical foramen in a tooth is the hole in the bottom of the root. Now, if you guys, you're obviously well aware of this, if you go to the mirror and smile and you see your teeth, you're going to see the teeth are different. Okay, we've got 4 general categories of teeth. We've got incisors, cuspids, bicuspids, and molars. These teeth are different in shape, so they're different in anatomy, and they're also different in the physiology and their function. The incisors, the ones we have right at the front, that's going to be used for clipping and cutting. Okay, so if you want to take a small bite of something, you'd use your front of your mouth, you'd use your incisors. If you needed to tear something or slash it or cut it, you'll probably move it a little bit far back, and you need to talk about your the cuspids or the canines. And then finally, our bicuspids and molars. Those are teeth that are bigger, they're stronger, and we use those more for crushing, mashing, grinding. So if you have something really hard to chew, you're not going to use your front teeth for that. It doesn't serve the function. You're going to use, or you're going to try and get it to the back of your mouth where your teeth are bigger and they're more designed for crushing stuff up. Again, this is showing the placement of the types of teeth, so you can see how they're labeled. You've got your incisors, canines, your molars, and your premolars and molars. Sorry.